Section 1. The relationship that felt stable until it didn't. The silence in our kitchen wasn't empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the weight of things left unsaid. For 6 years, Emily and I had built a life that felt like a fortress, constructed from shared dreams and the predictable rhythm of a suburban Sunday. I remember watching her pour coffee, the steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons between us, and realizing that she wasn't actually looking at me. She was looking through me, focused on a point somewhere in the distance that I couldn't see. It was a subtle shift, a hairline fracture in the foundation of our world, but I felt the cold air rushing in through the gap. How do you tell someone that you feel them disappearing? I stayed silent because the words felt too heavy to lift, and the fear of being right was far more terrifying than the comfort of my own denial. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of intimacy that left me questioning my own sanity. We still shared a bed, but the space between us had grown into a vast, uncrossable canyon where touch was accidental and conversation was strictly logistical. I watched her meticulously organize her life, her movements becoming more efficient and less inclusive of my presence. She was building a world inside our home that didn't require my participation, a silent architecture of independence that felt like a betrayal of every promise we'd ever made. Was I the only one who felt the floor tilting beneath our feet? I noticed the way she avoided my gaze during dinner, her eyes darting toward the window as if looking for an exit strategy that didn't involve a scene. I remember a specific evening at our friend's house, Michael Grant and his wife, where the contrast between their easy laughter and our forced smiles felt like a physical weight. Michael caught my eye across the table, a brief moment of silent recognition that made my stomach churn with a sudden, sharp humiliation. He saw it too. He saw the way Emily sat slightly turned away from me, her body language screaming for a distance that her words hadn't yet dared to demand. I realized then that my dignity was tied to a performance I was no longer capable of maintaining. Why was I still playing the role of the happy husband when the lead actress had already walked off the stage in her mind? The realization was a cold, sharp blade that cut through the haze of my confusion. As the weeks bled into months, the internal monologue in my head became a relentless interrogation of every moment we spent together. I began to track the minute changes in her behavior with the precision of a forensic investigator, noting the way she spoke about the future in the singular. "I might take that job in the city," she would say, instead of, "We should think about moving closer to the office." The shift from we to I was a quiet assassination of our shared identity, a linguistic divorce that preceded the legal one by years. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far she would go before she realized I was watching her build the walls of my own exclusion. That was the moment I understood that the person I loved was being replaced by a stranger who saw me as an obstacle. I started to feel like a ghost in my own house, a lingering spirit haunting a life that had already moved on without me. I would watch her from the doorway of the living room, observing her as she researched new apartments or looked at travel destinations on her laptop, her face illuminated by the cold, blue light of the screen. She didn't hide it, not exactly, but she didn't share it either. It was as if I had become a piece of furniture, a familiar but ultimately unnecessary part of the landscape. I wondered if she even remembered the version of us that used to laugh until our lungs burned. The psychological pressure of being ignored while physically present was a slow burn torture that tested the very limits of my self-control and my remaining pride. Michael Grant called me one afternoon, his voice laced with a careful, measured concern that felt like an insult to my competence. He asked how things were at home, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer was collapsing. I told him everything was fine, my voice a practiced mask of stability that felt heavier with every word. Why did I feel the need to protect the image of a relationship that was already a hollow shell? I realized that my own ego was the primary architect of my suffering, a silent partner in the humiliation that Emily was orchestrating with her quiet detachment. I was waiting for a confrontation that I knew would never come, because Emily didn't want a fight. She wanted a clean break, a surgical removal of me from her narrative. The realization that I no longer mattered wasn't a single blow, but 1,000 small cuts delivered with the precision of a professional. I watched her buy new clothes that didn't fit the aesthetic of our life together, a wardrobe for a woman I didn't recognize, and a life I wasn't invited to lead. Every new purchase felt like a brick in the wall she was building between us, a tangible manifestation of her desire to be someone else, somewhere else. I stayed silent because I knew that any protest would only accelerate her departure, and I wasn't ready to let go of the leverage that my silence provided. I was observing her exit, recording every detail of her betrayal so that when the time came, I would be the one with the final word. The pressure reached a boiling point on our 6th anniversary, a day that should have been a celebration but felt more like a funeral for a hope I hadn't yet buried. We went to a quiet, upscale restaurant where the lighting was dim and the service was impeccable, a perfect stage for a performance of domestic bliss. Emily sat across from me, her face a mask of polite indifference that made me want to scream. She gave me a gift, a book on architecture that I had mentioned months ago, and I realized she was buying my silence with a gesture that felt as hollow as our conversation. She wasn't celebrating us, she was fulfilling an obligation before she finally closed the book on our life. I looked at her and felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. I stayed silent because I realized that the woman sitting across from me didn't know who I was anymore. She saw a man who was predictable, stable, and ultimately disposable. She didn't see the fire beginning to burn beneath the surface of my restraint, the cold determination to transform my humiliation into a source of power. I realized that her betrayal wasn't about another man. It was about a version of herself that didn't include me. That was the moment I understood that my only path forward was to become the version of myself that she could never have imagined. I looked at the book she gave me and felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. I knew something she didn't, a truth that would change the trajectory of both our lives. The evening ended with a polite kiss on the cheek, a gesture so devoid of passion it felt like a signature on a contract. As we walked to the car, the cool night air felt like a premonition of the isolation to come. I drove in silence, the hum of the engine, the only sound in a world that felt increasingly fragile. I looked at Emily in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, as if the decision to leave had already been made, and she was simply waiting for the clock to run out. I realized then that I was no longer fighting for her. I was fighting for the man I would become after she was gone. But what would happen when she realized I had already started leaving too? Section 2. I noticed her future didn't include questions anymore. The digital evidence of my obsolescence was more painful than any physical distance could ever be. I discovered her secret calendar by accident, a shared account with Sophia Lane that I had once been a part of, but had since been quietly removed from. It was a roadmap of a life I wasn't invited to, filled with appointments for apartment viewings, meetings with financial planners, and social gatherings that didn't include my name. The betrayal wasn't in the actions themselves, but in the meticulousness of her planning. She wasn't just leaving, she was erasing me from her future with a cold, calculated efficiency that made my blood run cold. Why hadn't she just told me she was done? I realized then that she wanted to ensure her own safety and comfort before she ever had to face the reality of my pain. I began to see Sophia Lane differently after that, her presence in our life appearing more like a co-conspirator than a friend. When Sophia came over for drinks, I watched the two of them huddled together, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial whisper whenever I entered the room. They were building Emily's new world right in front of me, using our living room as a staging ground for a life that I would never see. The humiliation was a dull ache in my chest, a constant reminder that I was being managed like a problem to be solved. I stayed silent because I wanted to understand the full scope of their strategy. I wanted to see the moment Emily truly believed she had won before I started my own quiet counteroffensive. It was during one of these evenings that I first heard the name Caleb Turner. He wasn't a lover, at least not yet, but he represented everything Emily wanted for her new life status, excitement, and a connection to a social circle that I had never cared to join. I listened from the kitchen as Sophia described Caleb's latest success, her voice dripping with an admiration that felt like a direct critique of my own stability. Emily listened with an intensity that she hadn't shown me in years, her eyes bright with a hunger for a world that felt more like a movie than a reality. I realized then that I wasn't being replaced by a person, but by a lifestyle. I was the old, reliable sedan she was trading in for a luxury vehicle she couldn't yet afford. The psychological pressure of being a spectator in my own life was becoming unbearable. A slow-motion car crash that I was forced to watch every single day. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was the only one who could see the absurdity of our situation. We were still eating dinner together, still talking about the weather, still playing the role of a couple while she was literally measuring the windows of her next apartment. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that made it hard to focus on anything else. I realized that my only defense was to detach myself emotionally before she could strike the final blow. I had to become as cold as the future she was planning. I started making my own plans, but I kept them buried deep beneath a surface of continued normalcy. I began to wake up earlier, using the quiet hours of the morning to work on projects that I had neglected for years. I focused on my career with a renewed intensity, pouring my frustration and my fear into a drive for success that felt like a weapon. If she wanted a life of status and power, I would build one that she could never reach. I stayed silent about my progress, letting her believe that I was still the same man who was content with the quiet life we had built. I wanted her to leave thinking she was the one moving on to bigger things, while I was the one who was truly evolving. One afternoon I came home early and found Emily in our bedroom, surrounded by boxes. She looked up, her face a mask of momentary panic, before she quickly composed herself into a look of practiced sadness. She told me she was just organizing some things for a donation drive, her voice steady but her eyes searching mine for any sign of suspicion. I nodded and smiled, a perfect imitation of the gullible husband she thought I was. "That's a great idea, Emily," I said, the irony of the statement tasting like ash in my mouth. I realized then that she was testing the waters, seeing how much she could get away with before I noticed the house was being emptied of her presence. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I saw Caleb Turner in person at a corporate gala a few weeks later, a man who radiated the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having to struggle. I watched him interact with the crowd, his movements polished and his words carefully chosen to maximize his impact. He was exactly what Emily wanted, a symbol of the life she thought she deserved. I felt a surge of cold, analytical observation as I watched them talk, noting the way she leaned toward him, her body language a mirror of the desire I had once seen directed at me. I stayed silent because I realized that Caleb wasn't my rival. He was my replacement in a game that I was no longer interested in playing. He was a placeholder for her ambition. The social imbalance was becoming more pronounced with every passing week as Emily's social circle shifted toward the people Sophia Lane introduced her to. I was no longer invited to the dinners or the gallery openings, my absence explained away with a casual lie about being too busy with work. I watched the photos appear on social media, images of Emily laughing with people I didn't know, in places I hadn't been invited to. The public humiliation was a slow poison, a gradual erosion of my status in our shared community. But instead of anger, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Every event I wasn't invited to was another hour I could spend building the foundation of my own future. I was becoming invisible, and in that invisibility, I found a new kind of power. I remember sitting in my office late one night, looking at a spreadsheet of my increasing financial independence, and realizing that I was no longer afraid of her leaving. The fear had been replaced by a cold, calculating patience. I was waiting for the moment her exit would be most complete, the moment she felt most secure in her new life, before I allowed her to see the man I had become in the shadows of her neglect. I realized that timing was the only authority that mattered in this transition. I had to let her believe she was the one in control, the one with the leverage, until the very last second. That was the moment I understood that true dominance isn't about winning a fight. It's about winning the silence that follows it. The final straw came when I found a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in the city, signed only in her name, hidden in a folder of old tax documents. It was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. She hadn't said a word, hadn't given me a single warning that our life was about to end in 14 days. The coldness of it was breathtaking, a level of betrayal that felt almost professional in its execution. I looked at the signature Emily Reed, written in her familiar looping script, and realized that the woman I had loved was truly gone. She was already living in that apartment in her mind. I walked back into the living room where she was watching television, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a quiet, lethal clarity. I knew exactly what I had to do next. Section 3. Distance can exist, even when you sleep next to someone. The mattress felt like a frozen tundra, a vast and unbridgeable landscape that stretched between us every night. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of Emily's breathing, and realize that she was already miles away. She wasn't sleeping in our bedroom. She was dreaming of a high-rise view and a life that didn't include the sound of my heartbeat. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if she would ever reach out in the dark, if some primal part of her still recognized me as her partner. But her hands remained tucked under her pillow, her body a closed circuit of self-preservation. That was the moment I understood that physical presence is the ultimate lie when the soul has already checked out. I noticed the way she started to curate her scent, switching from the floral perfume I'd bought her to something sharper, colder something, that smelled like expensive lobbies and ambition. It was a sensory betrayal, a subtle olfactory signal that she was shedding the skin of the woman I once knew. I would sit in the living room and smell her passing by, the fragrance lingering like a threat in the air. Why does a person change their scent before they change their address? I realized she was practicing being a stranger, testing out a new identity in the safety of our dying relationship. The psychological pressure of living with a ghost who still had a pulse was a weight that I carried into every room. We attended a dinner party at Sophia Lane's penthouse, a glass box suspended over the city that felt like a glimpse into Emily's desired future. I watched her move through the room with a practiced grace, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd for Caleb Turner or someone of his stature. She spoke to me only when necessary, her voice a clipped, professional tone that she might use with a subordinate. I stayed silent because I was busy observing the social hierarchy of the room, realizing that Emily was trying to climb a ladder that I had already decided to dismantle. Every polite smile she gave me was a needle under my fingernails, a reminder of the humiliation she was serving on a silver platter. The internal monologue in my head was becoming a cold, strategic calculation of every interaction we had. I started to wonder how many of our happy memories were actually just rehearsals for her eventual departure. Had she been planning this for years, Or was it a sudden realization that I was no longer an asset to her brand? I stayed silent because the answer didn't matter as much as my reaction to it. I was no longer the victim of her story. I was the silent architect of my own. I watched her laugh at a joke Michael Grant made, and for the first time, I felt a wave of genuine pity for her. She was chasing a shadow, while I was building a mountain in the dark. One night, she accidentally left her phone unlocked on the nightstand while she was in the shower. I didn't look for messages from other men. I looked for the logistics of her exit. I found a spreadsheet titled New Beginning, detailing everything from the cost of movers to the price of a designer sofa for her new apartment. There was no mention of me, no buyout for our shared items, just a clean surgical list of her new life. I realized then that I wasn't even a line item in her budget. I was a zero-cost asset she was simply abandoning. The realization was a cold, sharp clarity that solidified my resolve to be the most expensive mistake she ever made. I noticed the way she started to talk about personal growth and finding one's true frequency, phrases that Sophia Lane clearly fed her like a slow-acting poison. These words were weapons designed to justify her betrayal, a linguistic shield against the guilt she should have been feeling. I stayed silent because I knew that arguing with a person who has already moralized their own selfishness is a waste of breath. I watched her perform this new, enlightened version of herself, and I felt a profound sense of disgust. She wasn't growing, she was just trading one mask for another, one that she thought looked better in the light of Caleb Turner's approval. The distance between us became a physical entity, a thick, invisible wall that muffled our voices and deadened our touch. We would sit on the sofa together watching a movie, and I could feel the coldness radiating off her like a dying star. She was so focused on the horizon that she didn't realize the ground she was standing on was already being sold from under her. Why do we stay in rooms where we are no longer welcome? I realized I was staying for the data, for the insight into how a person can unmake a home without ever raising their voice. That was the moment I understood that silence is the most sophisticated form of surveillance. I began to withdraw my own energy, a mirror image of her detachment that she was too self-absorbed to notice. I stopped asking about her day, stopped offering to make dinner, and stopped looking for her in the quiet moments of the evening. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if my absence would be as loud as her departure. But she didn't notice. She was too busy decorating a life I hadn't been invited to, too busy being the hero of a story where I was the fading background character. The psychological pressure of being ignored by the person you sleep next to is a slow burn torture that requires a titanium will to survive. Michael Grant pulled me aside at a bar one Friday, his face a mask of awkward sympathy. He asked if I was doing okay with everything, his eyes shifting toward the door as if he expected Emily to walk in with someone else. I realized then that the rumors were already starting, that our social circle was already mourning a relationship that I was still physically in. I stayed silent because I didn't want his pity. I wanted his respect, and respect is never earned through vulnerability in a world of wolves. I told him I had never been better, and for the first time, it wasn't a lie. I was becoming the man who didn't need the world she was so desperate to join. As I lay in bed that final night of the week, I felt a strange sense of peace. The lease she had signed was a ticking clock, and I was counting every second with a cold, rhythmic precision. She shifted in her sleep, her foot brushing against mine, and I felt nothing but a distant, analytical curiosity. How long would it take for her to realize that the person she was leaving wasn't the person she was actually walking away from? I stayed silent because the truth was a gift she didn't deserve. I looked at the moonlight hitting the wall and realized that the distance between us was now the only thing keeping me sane. I was ready for the next phase of the collapse. Section 4. She was preparing to leave while I was still choosing us. The irony of the final 14 days was a bitter pill that I swallowed every morning with my coffee. While she was secretly labeling boxes and transferring funds, I was deliberately choosing to maintain the facade of a man who was still committed to the us we had built. I stayed silent because I wanted to see the full extent of her duplicity, to witness the exact moment she believed her deception was complete. Every "I love you," she whispered, felt like a small, sharp stone she was placing in my hand, a collection of lies I would eventually use to build my own fortress. Why does a person lie when the truth is already packed in a suitcase? I realized she didn't want to be the villain. She wanted to be the victim who was forced to leave. I watched her meticulously go through our shared photos, selecting only the ones where I looked tired or distracted to keep for her digital archives. She was rewriting our history in real time, creating a narrative of a dying love to justify her cold-blooded exit. I stayed silent because I was doing the same, but my narrative was based on the hard, cold facts of her betrayal. I realized that memory is a weapon that can be sharpened on both sides. She thought she was erasing me, but she was actually just giving me the blueprint for her own obsolescence. That was the moment I understood that the version of me she was choosing to leave was a ghost I had created for her. The psychological pressure of these 2 weeks was like a tightening vice, a constant test of my ability to remain calm while the walls of my life were being dismantled. I found a hidden folder on her laptop filled with screenshots of luxury furniture and interior design ideas for her new place. It was a gallery of my exclusion, a visual representation of a future where I didn't exist. I stayed silent because I was building my own folder, a portfolio of investments and career moves that would eventually dwarf her new life. I realized that while she was playing house, I was playing a much larger game. The status she craved was something I was quietly acquiring with every hour she spent ignoring me. I remember a specific morning when she asked me what I wanted for dinner, her voice airy and light, as if we had decades of dinners ahead of us. I looked at her and saw the mask slipping for just a second, a flicker of guilt or perhaps just exhaustion from the weight of her own lie. I stayed silent for a beat too long, watching the panic rise in her eyes before I gave her a simple, mundane answer. "Whatever you want, Emily," I said, the words a double-edged sword. I realized then that I was the one holding the power because I knew the ending of the story while she was still trying to figure out the middle. I was chooses us, not as a future, but as a strategic anchor. Sophia Lane started calling her more frequently. Their conversations, a series of hushed giggles and coded language that filled our house with a toxic energy. I would walk into the room and the silence would fall like a heavy curtain, a sudden and artificial stillness that made my skin crawl. They were celebrating her escape, while I was still paying the mortgage on her prison. Why do people think they are being clever when their betrayal is as obvious as a bruise? I realized that Emily's arrogance was her greatest weakness. She truly believed that I was too dull, too stable, to notice the house was being emptied of its soul. I stayed silent because her overconfidence was my greatest asset. I started to move my own sentimental items into a secure storage unit, things she wouldn't miss, but that represented the true heart of my history. I did it quietly, in the middle of the day, while she was at work, which I knew was actually her spending time at the new apartment. I stayed silent because I wanted the house to feel empty to her long before she actually left it. I wanted her to feel the hollow ring of the rooms, the way the air seemed to thin out when I wasn't there to provide the warmth. I realized that I was performing a slow-motion eviction of my own spirit from our shared space. The psychological dominance of being the first to emotionally exit is a power that can't be taught. The evening before her scheduled move, we sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where we had planned our wedding and talked about children. She looked at me with a strange, lingering intensity, a look that seemed to be searching for a reason to stay or a reason to go faster. I stayed silent, offering her nothing but a polite, empty smile. I realized then that she was waiting for me to make it easy for her, to give her a fight or a reason to feel justified in her cruelty. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. I would be the perfect partner until the very second she walked out the door. The pressure of my perfection was the ultimate psychological weapon. I watched her pack her last few things into a small bag, a performance of someone just going away for a weekend. The lies were becoming so transparent they were almost beautiful in their absurdity. I realized that she was terrified of the confrontation, terrified of the moment she would have to look me in the eye and admit she was a coward. I stayed silent because I wanted her to carry that cowardice with her into her new, shiny life. I wanted it to be the first thing she unpacked in her luxury apartment. That was the moment I understood that true moral victory isn't about the reveal. It's about the silence that precedes it. The night was long and filled with the sound of her tossing and turning, her body unable to find rest in a bed she had already abandoned. I stayed awake, staring into the darkness, feeling the final threads of our connection snap one by one. I realized that I was no longer the man who had started this week. I was harder, colder, and infinitely more focused. I had spent 14 days choosing a version of us that allowed me to exit with my dignity intact, while she had spent them choosing a version of herself that was built on a foundation of deceit. Who was the real winner in a game where both players had already left the field? As the sun began to rise on the morning of her departure, the house felt like a stage set waiting for the final act. I watched her get dressed, her movements frantic and disjointed, her eyes avoiding mine at all costs. She told me she was going to spend the day with Sophia, a lie so practiced it barely required effort. I stayed silent, nodding my head as I watched her walk toward the door with her small bag. I realized that she thought she was leaving me behind, but I was the one who had already moved on. As the door clicked shut, I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The silence was finally absolute. But what would she do when she realized I hadn't changed the locks, but I had changed the man she thought she knew? Section 5. I started building a life she wouldn't recognize. The day after the door clicked shut, I didn't change the locks. I changed the atmosphere of the house. I spent the morning clearing out the remnants of her presence. The lingering scents, the stray hairpins, the half-empty bottles of expensive lotion she'd forgotten. I realized that the silence she left behind wasn't a void, but a workspace. I stayed silent because the neighbors were watching, waiting for a breakdown that would never come. I moved my desk into the center of the living room, transforming our shared sanctuary into a command center for my own ambition. That was the moment I understood that the only way to truly erase her influence was to overwrite it with a version of myself she had never met. My transformation began with the brutal audit of my own habits and weaknesses. I started waking up at 4 in the morning, the cold air of the house serving as a physical reminder of my new reality. I poured myself into my work at the firm, taking on the high-risk projects that Michael Grant and others had deemed too volatile. I stayed silent while my colleagues whispered about my sudden intensity, their eyes searching for a sign of grief in my performance. I realized that my pain was a high-octane fuel, a resource that Emily had unknowingly gifted me when she walked out that door. The psychological pressure of being the man who was left became the very thing that made me untouchable. I began to invest in my physical presence with a clinical, almost detached precision. I replaced the comfortable, unassuming wardrobe Emily had helped me curate with tailored suits that felt like armor. I started training with a level of discipline that bordered on obsession, watching my body sharpen and harden in the mirror. I stayed silent when I saw Sophia Lane at a local coffee shop, her eyes widening as she took in the changes I had made in just a few short months. I realized that she was the conduit for the information Emily was surely seeking. That was the moment I understood that my silence was more communicative than any shouting match could ever be. The business world started to respond to this new, colder version of Jonathan Reed. I negotiated deals with a quiet, lethal efficiency that left older, more experienced men looking for the exit. I realized that I no longer cared about being liked, I cared about being effective. I stayed silent during meetings, letting the other side fill the space with their own anxiety and mistakes. The social imbalance was shifting, but this time I was the one holding the leverage. I was building a reputation as a man who was patient, restrained, and utterly focused. Why had I ever settled for the version of myself that Emily thought was stable enough to leave? I received an invitation to a high-profile industry mixer, the kind of event Caleb Turner would normally dominate. I attended alone, wearing my new confidence like a second skin. I stayed silent as I stood on the periphery, observing the room with the analytical gaze of a predator. I realized that the people here were all playing a game of status, but I was the only one who had already lost everything and realized I was still standing. That was the moment I understood that true power comes from the ability to be alone and thrive. I watched Caleb from across the room and felt a strange, cold satisfaction. He was still playing the role, while I had become the script. I started acquiring assets, not just for the sake of wealth, but for the sake of permanence. I bought into a boutique firm that focused on disruptive technologies, a move that Emily would have deemed too risky for our stable life. I stayed silent as the returns began to exceed even my own projections, the numbers on my screen, a private validation of my new trajectory. I realized that I was building a life that wouldn't just exclude her, it would be unrecognizable to her. Every success was another brick in a wall that she would never be able to scale. The pressure I felt was no longer from the betrayal, but from the speed of my own ascent. One evening, I found myself back at the restaurant where we had our final hollow anniversary. I sat at the bar, alone, and ordered a drink that I would have never chosen in my previous life. I stayed silent as I watched couples at the tables, their faces illuminated by the same dim lighting that had once masked Emily's detachment. I realized that I wasn't looking for a replacement for her. I was looking for the man she had tried to bury under the weight of her own ambition. That was the moment I understood that my survival wasn't a fluke. It was a design. I was becoming the authority of my own life, and the timing was finally on my side. I noticed that Michael Grant's tone had shifted from pity to a wary, almost intimidated respect. He started asking for my advice on his own career moves, his voice suggesting that he saw me as someone who had unlocked a secret level of existence. I stayed silent about the cost of my growth, the nights of isolation and the cold clarity of my internal monologue. I realized that people don't want to know about the struggle, they only want to bask in the results. The psychological pressure of maintaining this new elite persona was a burden I carried with a quiet, practiced ease. I was the man Emily left, but I was also the man everyone else wanted to be. The news of my success began to ripple through our old social circles, a quiet but undeniable wave of information. I stayed silent as I received check-in texts from people who hadn't spoken to me since the day Emily left. I realized that status is the only language that some people understand, and I was finally speaking it with a perfect accent. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for the absolute erasure of her power over my self-worth. That was the moment I understood that the best way to win was to become a person who didn't even remember what the fight was about. My life was becoming a masterpiece of strategic silence. As the first year of my new life came to a close, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, a glass-walled sanctuary that overlooked the city she so desperately wanted to conquer. I looked down at the streets below and felt a profound sense of detachment. I stayed silent as I realized that I had achieved more in 12 months than we had in 6 years. I realized that Emily hadn't left a version of me. She had left a version of herself that I was no longer willing to carry. But as I turned to go inside, my phone lit up with a notification from an unknown number. It was a message that asked a question I wasn't prepared for. What would happen when the past tried to find its way into a future it didn't belong in? Section 6. Success changes the direction of regret. The message was from Sophia Lane, but the voice behind it was unmistakable. It was a tentative, careful inquiry about how I was doing, wrapped in the guise of a friendly check-in. I stayed silent, staring at the screen for several minutes before I deleted the notification without responding. I realized that the regret was starting to change directions, moving away from my heart and toward the high-rise Emily had fought so hard to inhabit. She was watching me from the sidelines now, seeing the man I had become through the filters of social media and mutual acquaintances. That was the moment I understood that success is the only weapon that doesn't leave a visible wound. The rumors reached me that Caleb Turner wasn't the savior Emily had imagined him to be. His status was a facade, a house of cards built on debt and the desperate need for validation. I stayed silent when I heard he had lost a major contract to my firm, a transaction I had overseen with a cold, professional detachment. I realized that the world Emily had traded me for was just as fragile as the one she had left behind. She had sought more, but she had found less with a better view. The psychological pressure of her mistake was now her burden to carry, a weight that would grow heavier with every headline I generated. I attended a gala where I knew she would be present, not as an act of confrontation, but as an act of presence. I stayed silent as I entered the room, my tailored suit and calm demeanor drawing eyes that used to look right through me. I saw Emily across the floor, standing next to a Caleb Turner who looked smaller, older, and more exhausted than I remembered. She looked at me, and for a split second, the mask of her cool detachment shattered. I realized that she was looking at a version of me she didn't recognize, a man who was not only surviving but thriving in the very world she had used to humiliate me. I moved through the gala with an effortless grace, engaging in high-stakes conversations with people who didn't even know Emily's name. I stayed silent when she finally approached me near the bar, her voice trembling slightly as she said my name. "Jonathan," she whispered, her eyes searching mine for any sign of the man she had abandoned. I looked at her and felt a strange, hollow sensation. I realized that the woman I had loved was gone, and the woman standing before me was just another social climber looking for a foothold. That was the moment I understood that the balance of power had reversed so completely that I didn't even feel the need to acknowledge it. She tried to initiate a conversation about the old days, a desperate attempt to find a bridge back to a person I no longer was. I stayed silent for a moment, letting the noise of the gala fill the space between us, before I gave her a polite, professional smile. "I don't spend much time thinking about the past, Emily," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any bitterness. I realized that my lack of anger was more devastating to her than any shouting match could have been. She wanted a reaction. She wanted to know she still had the power to hurt me. Instead, she found a man who had simply moved on to a different frequency. The social imbalance in the room was palpable, as people who had once ignored me now flocked to my side, leaving Emily and Caleb in a shrinking circle of obsolescence. I stayed silent as I watched Sophia Lane try to maneuver her way back into my good graces, her previous betrayals forgotten in the light of my current success. I realized that these people were all mirrors, reflecting back whatever light was currently the brightest. I was the sun in this room, and Emily was a moon that had lost its orbit. The psychological dominance of my silence was a masterclass in emotional warfare. I watched her leave the gala early, her head held high but her shoulders tight with the weight of a realization she couldn't outrun. I stayed silent as I finished my drink, turning my attention back to a conversation about a new merger. I realized that she had left me to find a better life, only to find that she was the one who was holding me back from the life I was meant to have. The irony was a cold, refreshing tonic. That was the moment I understood that timing is the final authority in every relationship. She had left too early to see the man I would become, and she had come back too late to find him still waiting. The internal monologue in my head was no longer about her betrayal. It was about my own expansion. I began to look at my life as a series of strategic moves, each one designed to increase my leverage and my autonomy. I stayed silent about my personal life, letting the mystery of my success grow into a legend that others could only speculate about. I realized that I didn't need a partner to validate my worth. I needed a purpose to drive my ambition. Emily was a lesson I had learned well, a chapter in a book that I had already finished reading. The pressure of my own growth was the only thing that mattered now. Michael Grant called me the next day, his voice filled with a hushed awe. "Everyone is talking about you, Jonathan," he said, his tone suggesting that I had achieved some kind of miraculous transformation. I stayed silent, letting him fill the silence with his own amazement. I realized that I had become a symbol for every man who had ever been left, a living proof that the ending isn't written by the one who walks away. I wasn't just successful, I was irreversible. That was the moment I understood that my true victory wasn't in the money or the status, but in the total loss of her relevance in my world. As I sat in my office that evening, looking out at the city lights, I realized that the regret Emily felt wasn't about losing me, it was about losing the person I had become without her. I stayed silent as I opened a new file on my laptop, a project that would define the next decade of my career. I realized that the emotional balance had been restored, but the scales were now permanently tipped in my favor. I looked at a photo of us from years ago that I had kept in a drawer, and for the first time, I didn't feel a pang of sadness. I felt a sense of closure that didn't require her permission. But what would she do when she realized that my growth was the only thing she couldn't take with her? Section 7. She wanted closure from a person I no longer was. The request for a meeting didn't arrive via a desperate late-night text or a tearful voicemail. It came through a formal email, typed with the same clinical precision she had once used to plan her departure. Emily wanted closure. It is a word the guilty use when they want the victim to sign a release form for their conscience. I sat in my office, the city lights shimmering like diamonds on the glass, and realized I felt no surge of anger, no heartbeat of anticipation. I stayed silent for 3 days before responding with a time and a place that suited my schedule, not hers. Why do people think they can walk back into a room they set on fire and ask for a tour of the ruins? I realized then that she wasn't looking for my forgiveness. She was looking for her own. We met at a quiet, architectural cafe, a place of sharp angles and cold stone that mirrored my internal state. Emily was already there, sitting at a small table looking smaller than I remembered, her eyes darting toward the door with a nervous energy that felt alien to the woman who had once systematically erased me. I stayed silent as I approached, noting the way she straightened her back, trying to summon the ghost of the authority she used to hold over my heart. I realized that the version of Jonathan Reed she was expecting, the one who would beg for explanations or demand apologies, had died the moment she signed that secret lease. That was the moment I understood that the greatest power you can have over someone is to be unrecognizable to them. She started talking, her voice a fragile melody of excuses wrapped in the language of self-discovery and unintentional pain. She spoke about Caleb, about the pressure of Sophia's expectations, and about how she had felt lost in the stability of our marriage. I stayed silent, watching her mouth move but feeling none of the words land. It was like listening to a foreign language I had once been fluent in but had since forgotten. I realized that her narrative required me to be the anchor that held her back, the weight she had to shed to fly. But as I sat there, successful, calm, and utterly detached, her story began to crumble under the weight of my reality. Who was the anchor now? The internal monologue in my head was a cold assessment of her tactics. She was trying to evoke our shared history, using old inside jokes and sentimental references like lures on a fishing line. I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the vacuum where my empathy used to be. Every time she reached for a memory, she found only the smooth, impenetrable surface of my indifference. I realized that her closure was actually a request for permission to move on without feeling like the villain of her own story. But I wasn't there to provide a happy ending for her. I was there to witness the final breath of a ghost I had already buried. The pressure of my silence was making her visibly unravel. She eventually stopped talking, the silence between us growing heavy and suffocating, a physical presence that she couldn't navigate. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a sudden, genuine fear. "You're so different, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. I stayed silent for a long beat, letting the observation hang in the air like a sentence. I realized that she was mourning the man she could control, the man whose reactions were predictable and whose love was a safety net. She had come looking for a person who no longer existed, and in his place she found a stranger who didn't even care enough to be angry. That was the moment I understood that true growth is irreversible. I noticed the way she looked at my watch, my suit, the way the staff treated me with a hushed, instinctive respect. She was seeing the fruit of the seeds she had planted when she left me in the dark. I stayed silent as she tried to apologize one last time, her words falling like dry leaves on a marble floor. I realized that she wanted me to tell her it was okay, that I understood why she did what she did. But I didn't understand, because I would never have done it to her. I stayed silent because my silence was the only honest response to her betrayal. Why should I provide comfort to the person who architected my greatest period of suffering? The psychological pressure in the cafe was reaching a breaking point. Emily began to realize that there was no bridge back, no path to reconciliation, not even a path to a friendly acquaintance. I stayed silent as she reached across the table to touch my hand, a gesture of intimacy that felt like a violation. I pulled my hand back slowly, deliberately, and watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. I realized that she had spent years thinking she was the one who had moved on, only to find out that I was the one who had actually traveled the furthest. She was still stuck in the cycle of her own choices, while I had transcended the very game she was playing. She asked if we could start over, if we could at least be friends in this new world I had built. I stayed silent as I stood up, buttoning my jacket with a slow, rhythmic precision. I realized that some things are too broken to be repurposed, and some people are too toxic to be allowed back into the fortress. I looked at her and saw not a partner, not an enemy, but a stranger who had once known my secrets. "I think you have the closure you were looking for, Emily," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. I realized then that the final act of power isn't a speech, it's the decision to leave the conversation entirely. As I walked out of the cafe, I didn't look back. I stayed silent as the cool air hit my face, a refreshing contrast to the stagnant atmosphere of the meeting. I realized that she was still sitting there, alone at that small table, realizing that the man she had discarded had become the man she could never deserve. The closure she wanted was a lie. She wanted a way to keep a piece of me while she pursued her new life. But I had taken every piece back, leaving her with nothing but the memory of a man who didn't need her. That was the moment I understood that my independence was the ultimate authority. My life was finally, truly my own. The cliffhanger wasn't a question of whether we would meet again, but a question of what she would do now that her last link to her old self was severed. I stayed silent as I drove away, the engine of my car a low, powerful hum in the quiet afternoon. I realized that Emily was now a ghost haunting her own life, while I was a man living in the vibrant, high-stakes present. She had wanted to see the man I had become, and she had seen him. But what would happen when the world realized that my success was built on the very foundation of her betrayal? I felt a quiet, lethal satisfaction. The story wasn't over. It had just reached its final, most powerful form. Section 8. What power feels like when nothing needs to be proven. True power doesn't scream, it doesn't even whisper. It exists in the absolute stillness of a man who knows he has already won. I stood in my office on the top floor of the Reed building, looking out at the skyline that once felt like a distant, unreachable dream. I stayed silent as I reviewed the final merger documents that would cement my position as a leader in the industry. I realized that I no longer felt the need to check Emily's social media or ask Michael Grant about her life. She had become a footnote in a much larger, much more significant story. That was the moment I understood that the ultimate revenge is to become so successful that the betrayal that started it all feels like a minor inconvenience. I attended a final industry gala, the pinnacle of the social season, where the most powerful names in the city gathered to exchange influence. I stayed silent as I entered the room, the crowd parting naturally as I moved toward the center of the event. I saw Sophia Lane and Caleb Turner in a corner, their faces pale and their posture defensive. They were no longer the architects of my humiliation. They were the casualties of their own shallow ambitions. I realized that I didn't feel a shred of triumph or a spark of malice toward them. I stayed silent because they were no longer relevant to the man I had become. They were shadows, and I was the light that made them visible. Emily was there too, standing by the bar, watching me with a look of profound, silent longing. She didn't approach me this time. She knew the boundaries of the silence I had established at the cafe. I stayed silent as our eyes met across the room for one final brief second. I realized that she was seeing the totality of her mistake, not just the wealth, not just the status, but the fundamental change in my soul. I was a man who was whole without her, a man who had used her exit as a launchpad rather than a grave. That was the moment I understood that the emotional balance of our lives had been permanently, irreversibly corrected. The internal monologue in my head was a serene reflection on the journey from the kitchen floor to this high-rise peak. I stayed silent as I accepted the congratulations of my peers, my voice a steady, low-tempo instrument of authority. I realized that my patience hadn't been a sign of weakness, but a sign of supreme competence. I had waited for the world to turn, and in the turning, I had found my true north. Why do we fear the silence of a breakup when it is the very thing that allows us to hear our own strength? I stayed silent because my life was now a testament to the power of restraint and the timing of a quiet, inevitable victory. I watched Caleb Turner try to engage me in a professional conversation, his tone desperate and his eyes searching for a lifeline. I stayed silent for a moment, looking at him not as a rival but as a cautionary tale. I realized that he was exactly what Emily had deserved, a man of surface and shadow. I gave him a polite, distant nod and moved on, leaving him to drown in the shallow water of his own making. That was the moment I understood that I didn't need to destroy my enemies. I only needed to outgrow them. The psychological dominance I held over that room was a natural consequence of my own self-mastery. The gala ended, and I walked out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of the city beneath my feet. I stayed silent as my driver pulled the car around, the sleek black vehicle a symbol of the order I had brought to my chaos. I realized that I was no longer the man who had been betrayed. I was the man who had been forged. Emily's quiet departure had been the greatest gift she could have ever given me, a surgical removal of a limitation I didn't know I had. I stayed silent because the gratitude I felt was a private, sacred thing. I had reached the summit, and the view was even better than I had imagined. I went back to my apartment and sat on the balcony, watching the city breathe below me. I stayed silent as I poured a glass of wine, the liquid catching the light of the stars. I realized that my life was no longer a response to Emily's betrayal. It was a creation of my own will. I had weaponized my patience and transformed my timing into an authority that no one could challenge. Why did I ever think her exit was the end of the world? I stayed silent because I knew that the world was just beginning. That was the moment I understood that the most dangerous man is the one who has nothing left to prove to anyone but himself. The final moral closure came not with a bang, but with a quiet indrawing of breath. I stayed silent as I thought about the years of silent endurance, the hours of observation, and the cold clarity of my internal separation. I realized that I had won because I had stayed true to the man I wanted to be, even when the woman I loved told me that man didn't matter. I stayed silent as I looked at the dark horizon, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction that was deeper than any public gloating could ever be. I was Jonathan Reed, and I was the master of my own narrative. The balance was restored, the lesson was learned, and the future was mine to command. I realized that Emily would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had stayed, if she had been the one to support the man I was becoming. I stayed silent because I knew the answer. She would have only held me back. Her departure was the catalyst, her betrayal was the fuel, and her absence was the space I needed to grow. I stayed silent as I finished my wine, the taste of success lingering on my tongue. I realized that true power is the ability to walk away from the past without looking back, to build a future that is so bright it makes the shadows of the past disappear. As the sun began to rise on the first day of my new, permanent reality, I felt a sense of irreversible growth. I stayed silent as the light filled the room, a warm, golden glow that felt like a benediction. I realized that I had achieved the ultimate moral victory, not through revenge, but through the quiet, dignified pursuit of my own excellence. Emily was a memory, Caleb was a footnote, and I was the author of a story that was just getting started. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to say. The work was done, the victory was complete, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what it felt like to be truly, powerfully alone. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.